Convicted of choking his 16-year-old ex-girlfriend to death.
Jholie Moussa was found dead in January of last year in Woodlawn Park, 2 weeks after she went missing.
Northern Virginia Bureau Chief Julie Carey was in the courtroom for this very emotional.
The third time, there was no struggle left to stop it. No one heard her. No one saw it happening. And in those final moments, the person standing closest to her was the same person who had already tried to take her life before. Not once, twice. The first time he tried to kill her, Jholie Moussa survived. He was arrested, removed from her school, and given a no-contact order. Then second time, she barely made it out. And somehow, after everything, she still went back. Before the incident, Jholie Moussa made a promise to her sister to stay away from him, but didn't stick to it. What makes someone return to the very place they almost lost their life? What do they say? What do they promise? That makes it feel safe again. That's the part that stays with you. I know a lot of people would have a lot of things to say about this case. The red flags in the relationship wasn't subtle. They were loud. And you will ask, didn't her parents see the signs? At what point do the parents step in and physically remove their child from a situation like that? Before we get into this, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Stories Chronicles and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, your city, your country. I want to see how far these stories reach. Jholie Moussa was only 16 years old. At that age, life is still just beginning to take shape. Plans aren't fully formed yet, but the dreams are there. The excitement is there. And for Jholie, there was a sense that something good was ahead of her. She lived in Fairfax County, Virginia with her family, in a home where she wasn't just known, she was deeply loved. But what made her story even more unique was the person she shared that life with every single day. Her identical twin sister, Jane. They weren't just siblings, they were inseparable. From the outside, people saw two girls who looked alike. But inside that bond was something deeper. Something constant. They moved through life side by side, sharing the same routines, the same space, the same experiences. If one of them was laughing, the other wasn't far behind. If one was upset, the other felt it almost immediately. Their connection was effortless. They understood each other in a way no one else could. There were moments where they didn't even need to speak. Just a look. Just a small expression, and they already knew what the other was thinking. For their family, that bond was something special to witness. Jholie brought warmth into every room she entered. She had a personality that drew people in, not loud or overbearing, but genuine. She connected easily with others. Friends described her as kind, easy to talk to, and full of life. The kind of person who made you feel comfortable without trying too hard. She wasn't hardened by the world yet. She still believed in people. And like many teenagers, she was starting to think about her future in a more serious way. School wasn't just something she attended, it was part of a bigger picture she was beginning to build. She had aspirations of going to college, with New York University being one of the names that stood out. It represented independence, opportunity, a new chapter. There was still so much ahead of her, moments she hadn't experienced yet, places she hadn't seen, a life that was still unfolding. At home, there was structure, care, and attention. Her family was involved, they paid attention, they were present. This wasn't a situation where she was left to figure everything out alone. She had people around her who cared deeply about her safety and her future. And yet, even in that kind of environment, things can still shift. Because sometimes, the biggest changes in a young person's life don't come from where they live, they come from who they meet. And for Jholie, everything started to change. The moment she met him. Nabiu Ibrahim entered Jholie's life the way many first relationships begin, quietly, naturally, without alarm. He was her first boyfriend, and that alone made the connection feel significant. For a 16-year-old, a first relationship can carry a kind of weight that's hard to explain. It feels new, exciting, and important all at once. To Jholie, this wasn't just someone she was talking to. It was someone she was choosing, and in the beginning, there were no obvious red flags. He came across as attentive, present, and interested in her. The kind of attention that can feel reassuring, especially at that age. Messages, calls, wanting to spend time together, it all blended into what looked like a normal teenage relationship. From the outside, nothing about it immediately suggested danger. But relationships don't shift all at once. They change in small ways first. What starts as a tension can slowly become expectation. What feels like care can begin to feel like pressure. And over time, those subtle changes start to build into something heavier. With Nbibu, that shift began to show through his reactions. There were moments where his tone would change. Moments where something small would trigger a response that felt out of proportion. A conversation that should have ended calmly would stretch into tension. Disagreements didn't just stay as disagreements, they lingered. Then came the questions. Where are you? Who are you with? Why didn't you answer? At first, those questions can feel harmless, even normal. But over time, they started to carry a different kind of weight. They weren't just questions anymore. They were expectations. And if those expectations weren't met, the atmosphere would change. There was a growing sense that things had to be handled carefully. That certain words, certain actions could set him off. And once that kind of tension enters a relationship, it doesn't stay hidden for long. Arguments became more frequent. What used to be small disagreements started to escalate, voices raised, emotions intensified. And after each conflict, there would be a reset, a moment where things seemed to calm down again. Apologies would follow. Promises would be made. I didn't mean it. It won't happen again. And for someone like Jholie, someone who believed in people, who wanted to see the good in them, those words mattered. They gave her a reason to stay. A reason to believe things could go back to how they were at the beginning. But underneath those apologies, something else was taking shape. A pattern. Because most abusive relationships don't start with violence. They start with moments that are easy to explain away. A reaction that seems like a bad day. A tone that feels temporary. A situation that feels like it can be fixed with understanding and patience. And slowly, those moments become more frequent, more intense, more difficult to ignore. By the time it becomes clear that something is wrong, there's already an emotional connection holding everything in place. For Jholie, that connection made it harder to step back, even as the relationship began to change in ways that couldn't be undone. The tension didn't disappear. It built, and then it crossed a line that would change everything. Then, it happened for the first time. The first time it turned physical. It didn't come out of nowhere. It followed an argument, one of those moments that had become more frequent, where emotions were already high, where something small had grown into something much bigger than it should have been. Voices raised, tension building, both of them caught in a moment that was already slipping out of control. But this time, it didn't end with words. It crossed into something else. What started as an argument became physical. He struck her. An act that on its own should have been enough to end everything right there. But it didn't stop at that. The situation escalated quickly, and before she could fully process what was happening, his hands were around her neck. He choked her. Not briefly. Not in a way that could be dismissed as accidental. It was forceful enough that she lost consciousness. In that moment, everything changed. Because once someone puts their hands around your throat like that, it's no longer just an argument. It's no longer just anger, it becomes something far more dangerous. Something that crosses into life and death. And yet, she survived. When she regained consciousness, the immediate danger had passed. The moment was over. But what remained wasn't just the physical impact, it was the emotional confusion that followed. Because what came next is what traps so many people in situations like this. He apologized, not casually, not dismissively, but in a way that felt serious enough to believe. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Words like that carry weight, especially when they come after something intense. They create a pause, a moment where the victim is left trying to reconcile what just happened with what they're being told now. For Jholie, those words mattered. She wasn't someone who expected the worst in people. She believed in second chances. She believed that people could make mistakes and then choose to do better. And in that moment, she chose to forgive him. This is where the pattern begins to take hold. Because after the violence comes remorse, after the fear comes reassurance, and between those two moments is where something powerful and dangerous forms. It's what's known as trauma bonding, a cycle where harm and apology become connected, where the emotional intensity of the situation creates a deeper attachment instead of pushing someone away. The fear, the relief, the apology, it all blends together, making it harder to leave than it should be. It creates confusion. It makes the victim question what they felt. It makes them believe that what just happened isn't the full picture, that the apology is the real version of the person. And over time, that cycle becomes harder to break. For Jholie, that first incident should have been the end. But instead, it became the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because once a line like that is crossed, and there are no real consequences, it doesn't just disappear. It returns. And when it does, it's rarely the same. It's worse. But it didn't stop there. After everything that had already happened, the next step should have been distance. And yet, the connection between them didn't completely break. This is where the story becomes difficult to understand from the outside, because logically, the answer seems simple: walk away. But emotionally, it's not always that simple. Jholie was still a teenager. This was her first relationship. The feelings attached to it weren't just casual, they were intense, personal, and deeply rooted in her experience of trust and connection. And when those emotions are mixed with moments of harm followed by apologies, it creates confusion. Because the same person who caused fear also became the one asking for forgiveness. And those apologies didn't come empty. They came with promises. And that's where the conflict begins. There's fear, because she had already experienced what he was capable of. But there's also hope, the belief that maybe those moments were exceptions, not the rule. That maybe things could go back to how they felt in the beginning. That combination of fear and hope can hold someone in place longer than it should. There's also the emotional weight of letting go. Ending a relationship isn't just about cutting contact. It's about letting go of what you thought it was, what you hoped it could be, and the version of the person you believed in. And for Jholie, that process hadn't fully happened. Instead of complete separation, there was still a connection. Still communication. Still a level of access that kept the door open. And once that door stays open, it allows everything else to follow. From the outside, it's easy to ask why. Why go back after everything? Why risk being in that position again? But inside that situation, the question feels different. Be honest. Do you think she knew how dangerous he was at this point? Or do you think she believed he would change? Let me know below. Because that belief, that things could be different this time, is what shapes the next decision. January 12, 2018, started like a normal day. Nothing about it stood out as different. No warning. No sign that this would be the day everything changed. Jholie was at home, moving through her usual routine, surrounded by the same environment that had always felt safe. At some point that day, she stepped out. It wasn't unusual. Teenagers go out, plans come up, messages are sent quickly, without much thought. Before leaving, she told her family she would be back. Simple, casual, nothing that raised concern. Later, she sent a message saying she was going to a party in Norfolk. That was the last time her family heard from her. At first, there was no immediate panic. A delayed response isn't always alarming. Phones die, plans change, time moves differently when you're out with friends. Everything still felt within the range of normal. But then hours passed. Evening turned into night. Messages went unanswered. Calls didn't go through. By the next day, that feeling shifted. What started as mild concern turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because this wasn't like her. Jholie wasn't someone who just disappeared without checking in, especially not with her twin sister, someone she was constantly in contact with. By January 13, the silence had stretched too far. Her family reported her missing. And from that moment, everything changed. The waiting began. Each passing hour carried more weight than the last. Every call, every notification, every possibility ran through their minds. Was she safe? Was she somewhere without signal? Was there a simple explanation they just hadn't seen yet? But as time continued to pass, those possibilities started to fade. Search efforts began. Authorities got involved. Information was gathered, but the timeline quickly became unclear. The last known details didn't lead anywhere solid. There was no clear location. No confirmed sighting after that final message. Days passed, not hours, days. And with each day, the sense of urgency grew stronger. The situation was no longer just concerning. It was critical. Her family held on to hope, but the silence was becoming harder to explain. Then came the shift. Because as investigators looked deeper into her last known movements, one detail began to stand out. She hadn't gone to a party. That part of the story didn't hold. Instead, what was uncovered pointed to something else, something much closer. Something connected to someone already in her life. She met him that night. Not by accident, not randomly. She was with Nabiu Ibrahim, the same person who had already crossed the line with her before. The same person who had already shown what he was capable of. That changes everything. Because now, the timeline doesn't just become unclear, it becomes focused. Her last known moments weren't spent in a crowd. They weren't surrounded by people. They were spent with him. And once that connection is made, the question is no longer, where is she? The question becomes, what happened between them that night? Because whatever took place after they met didn't leave room for her to come back home. And what happened next, no one saw coming. When investigators finally narrowed the timeline down to that night, the focus became unavoidable. At some point during that encounter, he put his hands around her neck. Not briefly, not as a moment that could be broken. He choked her. Asphyxiation isn't instant, it takes time. It requires sustained pressure. It means there was a moment and then another where he continued, fully aware of what he was doing. There was time to stop, but he didn't. The act itself wasn't sudden, it was prolonged enough to end her life. The autopsy would later confirm that she died from asphyxia, combined with blunt force trauma. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was a continuation of everything that had already happened before, only this time, there was no surviving it. And in that moment, everything that had defined Jholie's life, her family, her twin sister, her future, was taken from her. But what happened next adds another layer to the story. Because after it was over, he didn't call for help. He didn't report what happened. Instead, he made a decision. He chose to hide it. He moved her body and left it in a wooded area near Woodlawn Park, covering it with leaves and debris in an attempt to conceal what he had done. It wasn't just about leaving the scene, it was about making sure she wouldn't be found easily. And then he came back. Not to turn himself in, but to cover it further. And then there's the detail that shifts this from violence to something even more disturbing. At some point before the murder, he had searched online for how long it takes to kill someone by choking them. That changes everything. Because it introduces intent. It means this wasn't just about what happened in the heat of the moment. It means there was a level of thought behind it. A willingness to understand how far he could go, and what it would take to end a life. And when you place that detail next to everything else, the previous attacks, the escalation, the final act, it becomes clear that this wasn't unpredictable. The signs had been there. The danger had already revealed itself more than once. But this time, there was no interruption, no survival, no second chance. What began as a relationship ended in a way that cannot be reversed. And as the truth of what happened that night began to come together, the story shifted completely, from searching for a missing girl to confronting the reality of what had been done to her. He was taken into custody, and as the investigation progressed, the details of what happened that night became clearer. This wasn't a case built on guesswork. It was built on what he admitted. He confessed. And in that confession, he described how he killed her, using what he referred to as an MMA-type chokehold. Not something accidental, not something unclear. A deliberate act that required force, time, and awareness. That detail alone made it impossible to frame what happened as a moment that got out of hand. It showed intent. In court, the weight of everything came into focus. The earlier assaults, the escalation, the final act, all of it presented together painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a single incident, it was a progression. Jholie's family sat in that courtroom, listening to the details of what had been done to her. For them, it wasn't just about hearing the facts, it was about reliving the loss in a space where there was no way to escape it. Her twin sister especially carried a silence that said more than words could. Losing someone is one thing. Losing someone you shared your entire life with, someone who was always there, that's something else entirely. When the sentence came, it was life in prison. A legal conclusion. A form of justice. But even with that sentence, there's a reality that doesn't change. Justice can punish the person responsible, but it cannot restore what was taken. It cannot bring her back. And for her family, that absence is permanent. Jholie's story leaves behind more than just a timeline of events. It leaves behind lessons that are difficult, but necessary to confront. Because one of the most important truths in cases like this is that not every dangerous situation looks dangerous at first. In the beginning, nothing about the relationship appeared extreme. There were no immediate signs that pointed to where it would end. It started like many others. Normal, familiar, easy to accept. But danger doesn't always arrive fully formed. It builds. And when it builds, it often follows a pattern. In this case, that pattern was clear. Conflict, violence, apology, and then repetition. Each time it became more intense. Each time the consequences grew more serious. Abuse doesn't stay at the same level. It escalates. And one of the most critical parts of that escalation is what happens after the first act of violence. Because that moment, the first time, often determines everything that follows. The first warning is rarely the last. That's not just a statement, it's a reality that shows up again and again in cases like this. Another difficult truth is the role silence plays. After the second attack, there was no report, no intervention that could create distance. And while that decision is often shaped by fear, confusion, or emotional attachment, it also leaves the situation unchanged. Silence doesn't stop the pattern, it allows it to continue. Patterns don't lie, people often ignore them. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: walking away is not weakness. There's a common belief that leaving means giving up, or that staying shows strength. But in situations where harm is repeated, distance is not failure, it's survival. Distance can save your life. These aren't just ideas, they're realities that have shown themselves in cases like this, over and over again. At the center of all of this is Jholie. Not just the case, not just the headlines, a 16-year-old girl who had a life ahead of her, a future that hadn't even had the chance to fully begin. She had plans, college, independence, experiences she hadn't reached yet, moments that were still waiting for her, and all of that was taken in a way that cannot be reversed. But beyond everything else, there's one loss that stands out in a different way. Her twin sister. From the beginning of their lives, they were never apart for long. They grew up side by side, sharing everything: time, space, experiences, understanding. That kind of bond doesn't fade, it doesn't weaken. And now one half of that bond is gone. Not gradually, not naturally, but suddenly, leaving behind a silence that didn't exist before. When you go back to the beginning of this story, one detail stands out more than anything else. She survived twice. She made it through moments that could have ended everything. But the third time, there was no surviving it. And that's what makes this story so difficult. Because it wasn't unpredictable, it didn't come out of nowhere. The signs were there, the pattern was there, and still, it reached the point where nothing could stop it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell me, at what point do you think this could have been stopped? Because sometimes, looking back is the only way to understand what should never be repeated.